Kids in Raymond, Washington had a story about the hermit on Willapa Ridge. But at 44 with $3,880 to his name, Curtis Okerlund was the man the county finally handed the tower the hermit had lived in. For $1 plus $740 in back survey and access fees, to settle a wildfire relief claim it had owed his dead father for 38 years. Curtis had $2,900 a month in disability pay, a burn scar down his right forearm, and a hometown that still called his family the Okerlunds, who ran off after the big burn. The clerk slid the paperwork across the counter like she was doing him a favor. 41 feet of rusted steel on a bald ridge, condemned its stairs half rotted through. Nobody would climb it. But at its base stood a steel shutter room, padlocked from the outside, and behind that door was the reason a man no one could name had climbed those stairs alone for 41 years. The rain came the first week of October and did not stop. Curtis had been back in Raymond for 19 days when the letter from the county came. He was renting the back half of a duplex on Duryea Street, $400 a month, a place with a water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Idaho, and a landlord who had looked at his name on the lease and said, "Slow, Okerlund. There used to be Okerlunds out here." Curtis had said there used to be. He did not say he was one of them. He had learned a long time ago that the name arrived in a room before he did, and that it was easier to let it sit there and cool. He was born in Raymond in the spring of 1982, in the flat green country where the Willapa River ran brown with the tide, and the log trucks came down off the ridges all day with their loads chained and dripping. His father, Ray Okerlund, had set chokers for 2 different outfits and cut firewood on the side, and the family had lived in a single wide on 4 acres up the North Fork Road until the summer Curtis was 6 years old, the summer of the big burn. After that they had lived in a lot of places, Aberdeen, then Longview, then a town in Idaho whose name Curtis could no longer picture. His father had died in a Longview hospital in 2009 with a bad heart and a worse reputation, and the reputation was the thing that lasted. In Raymond, if you were old enough, you still knew the story. The Okerlund burn. The fire that started at their place and ran the valley, and took 11 houses and a church, and the Peterson boys' dog, and everything the town had that summer. The family that packed up and left in the night rather than answer for it. None of that was true, the part about answering for it. They had left because there was nothing to stay for, and no one who would look Ray in the eye at the feed store. But a town keeps the version of a story that is easiest to carry, and the easy version was that the Okerlunds ran. Curtis had spent most of his life a long way from the easy version. He had joined the Army at 18 because it was the fastest door out of Idaho, and he had gotten out at 24 and gone to the fire. That was the only way he could ever describe it to people, that he had gone to the fire like it was a place. He had cut line on hotshot crews out of Oregon, and then Montana, had worked his way up to crew boss on a Type 2 outfit. 20 men under him on the worst ground in the West. He was good at it. He was good at it the way some men are good at reading weather, which is to say he could stand on a ridge and feel a fire decide what it was going to do, maybe a full minute before it did it. He had never told anyone why he was good at it. He was not entirely sure himself, though he suspected it had something to do with a night when he was 6 years old. He had gone back into the Army at 31, into a guard unit, because the fire seasons were getting long and the pay was better with a uniform, and he had deployed twice. And on the second one, a fuel fire in a motor pool had put him on the ground with his right arm, and the right side of his back opened up in a way that took 4 surgeries and 11 months to close. The scar ran from his wrist to his elbow, a shine of grafted skin the color of a peeled birch. He could still use the arm. He could not always feel what it was touching. They had given him a medical discharge and a percentage and a folder of pamphlets, and he had spent 3 years in Spokane not doing much of anything before the thing that always happens to men like him happened, which is that the only place he had ever felt like himself was the one place he had spent his whole life leaving. So he came home. He did not tell himself it was to fix anything. There was nothing to fix. His mother, Diane, was in a memory care place in Chehalis and did not always know him. His father was 17 years dead. There was no house on the North Fork Road anymore, just a cleared pad and a rusted culvert and a stand of red alder grown up thick as a wall. But the country pulled at him the way a scar pulls at the weather, and he had $3,880 in a truck, and no reason to be anywhere else, so he came back to the one town that would rather he hadn't. The county letter was a single page, printed on the kind of paper that comes out of a machine that has printed 100,000 pages just like it. It was from the Pacific County Treasurer's office, and it concerned, the letter said, a dormant relief claim, number PC 880417, filed in the name of Raymond A. Okerlund, deceased, and it asked Curtis, as the identified surviving heir, to come to the courthouse in South Bend to discuss its disposition. Curtis read it twice standing in the duplex kitchen with the rain going on the window and could not make sense of it. A relief claim. His father had filed a relief claim. He had not known that. In the version of the story he carried, his father had never asked the county for anything, had been too proud and too angry, had loaded the truck and gone. But here was a claim number with his father's name on it, 38 years old, still open. He drove down to South Bend on a Tuesday. The Willapa was high, and the color of coffee, and the log yards along the highway were dark with rain. The decks of fresh-cut fir stacked 40 feet high and steaming faintly where the sawn ends met the cold. South Bend called itself the oyster capital of the world on a sign coming into town, and the courthouse sat up on a low hill above the river, a gray stone building with a dome, too grand for the place, built in a year when men still believed the county was going to be something. Inside it smelled like floor wax and wet wool. The treasurer's clerk was a woman about 60 with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and when Curtis gave his name, she looked at it on her screen for a while before she looked at him. "You're the son," she said. "I'm the son," Curtis said. She had the file. It was a real paper file, brown and soft at the corners, and she opened it flat on the counter between them and turned it so he could read. The top page was his father's claim, in his father's handwriting, which Curtis had not seen in 20 years, and which went through him like a cold hand. Ray Okerlund had a small, hard, backward-leaning hand, and he had filled out the form in August of 1988, asking the county's Wildfire Relief Fund to compensate the family for a single-wide home and 4 acres of improvements and a well and a shed and a 1979 Chevrolet. Total claimed loss $9,400, and stapled to it, the clerk said, turning the page, was the reason it had never been paid. The second page was a determination from the fire marshal's office, dated November of 1988, and it found that the fire had originated on the Okerlund parcel, caused a permitted debris burn left unattended, and that a claimant could not be compensated by the relief fund for a loss the claimant had caused. Curtis read it standing very still. There it was in county ink, the thing his whole childhood had been shaped around. His father had burned down the valley, and then had the nerve to ask the valley to pay him for his trouble, and the valley had said no, and the family had left. He felt the old heat come up the back of his neck, and he made it lie down. He had gotten good at that, too. "There's a third page," the clerk said. The third page was newer, laser-printed, and it was the part that made no sense. In 2019, the state legislature had passed a bill directing counties to close out dormant claims against the old wildfire relief funds, which had been folded into the general accounts decades before. Most were closed at zero. But Ray Okerlund's claim had a note on it, a handwritten note in a different hand, older, that some clerk in 1989 had clipped to the file and initialed. The note said that the origin determination was disputed by a witness, that the disputing witness had declined to give a statement for the record, and that the claim should be held open pending review. The review had never happened. The witness had never been named. The claim had sat in the brown folder for 31 years with a question mark on it, that nobody in the building had been alive to answer. So legally, the clerk said, we can't pay it, because the determination stands. But we can't zero it either because it's flag disputed and we've got no authority to unflag a thing we can't investigate. It's been kicked upstairs 4 times. Nobody wants it. She took her glasses off and let them fall against her chest on the beaded chain. The commissioners approved a settlement. It's not money. There isn't any money, and honestly, Mr. Okerlund, if I told you what the fund's worth now, you'd laugh. What there is a parcel. She slid another page across. It was a legal description, township and range, and a parcel number, and a name Curtis had not heard in a long time. Willapa Ridge Lookout. Government Lot 3, a little under an acre, a steel fire tower and its footings, and a strip of access easement running up an old fire road off the North Fork. The county had taken title to it in 1996 when the Forest Service surplused it and had been trying to get rid of it ever since. It was condemned. It was assessed at $1 because the improvements were a liability, not a value, and the county would deed it to the heir of the disputed claim for that $1 plus $740 in back survey and access fees that had accrued against the easement, which was, the clerk said, the cheapest way anyone had yet found to make the file go away. "You don't have to take it," she said. "Most people wouldn't. It's a wreck. You take it. You own the wreck. The county's out from under it, and your dad's claim gets marked settled." She looked at him. "I'll be straight with you. It's a bad deal. But it's the only thing anybody's ever offered your family, and I've been in this office 30 years, and I remember when they offered you nothing at all." Curtis paid the $741 with a debit card. It left him with $3,139 and a deed to a tower he had never seen, on a ridge he had spent his whole life driving past. He asked the clerk, before he left, whether she knew who the disputing witness had been, the one who said the fire hadn't started at his father's place. She said she didn't. She said the note wasn't signed, only initialed, and the initials were DS, and that whoever DS was, he was almost certainly dead, because the file was old enough that most of the people in it were. Curtis drove home in the dark with the heater going, and the wipers going, and the deed on the seat beside him in a manila envelope. And somewhere north of Raymond, where the North Fork Road turned off the highway, he slowed the truck without deciding to. The alder wall stood black against a blacker sky. Up above it, invisible in the cloud, Willapa Ridge ran east into the dark, and on the highest shoulder of it, if the map on the seat was right, a steel tower was standing where it had stood since 1934, and had been standing empty, so far as he knew, for a long time. He did not drive up that night. The fire road would be washed out, and his headlights were not enough, and he was not, he told himself, in any hurry. He went back to the duplex and lay on the bed with his boots off and his burned arm across his chest and did not sleep, and thought about the initials DS, and about a night when he was 6 years old that he had spent 38 years refusing to look at directly. He looked at it now. He remembered the smell first, always the smell, resin and green wood burning wrong, and then his mother's hands on him lifting him out of bed and the light. The light had come in the windows of the single wide the color of a stove burner, orange going to red, and it had moved. That was the thing a person never forgot once they had seen it, that fire had a will, that the light on the wall could think. He remembered his father with the phone, the old wall phone with the long cord, saying the word road over and over. And he remembered that the phone was dead, and he remembered, though for years he had told himself he had made it up, a voice. Not on the phone, on a radio. His father had a base station CB in the shed for talking to the log trucks, and someone had come across it that night, a voice Curtis did not know, flat and calm and very sure, and the voice had said a thing that his father moved to, that made his father grab the keys and put them all in the truck and drive not down the North Fork Road toward town, which was the way they always went, which was the way the fire was, but up the fire road and over the shoulder of the ridge and down the far side to the Nazelle cutoff, the long way, the empty way, the way that was still open. They had gotten out because a voice on a radio told them which way the fire was not. Curtis had asked his father, once years later, who the voice had been. His father had been drinking and did not want to talk about that summer, ever, and he had said only that it was the lookout, the man on the ridge, and that it didn't matter who because the man had never come down to be thanked and never would. Then, he had said the thing Curtis remembered longest. He had said, "He saved us and he cost us," same night. That's this place all over. Curtis had not understood it then. He was starting to now. He went up the ridge on the second Saturday of October, in a break between rains, with a chainsaw and a come-along and a spool of nylon rope and a battery lantern in the bed of the truck, because he was a man who had spent his life going up bad roads to look at bad country, and it did not occur to him to do it any other way. The fire road climbed off the North Fork in switchbacks under a canopy, so thick the day never fully arrived. It had not been graded in years. Alders had come up in the ditches and huckleberry had closed over the cut banks, and in 2 places the road was down to 1 lane, where the shoulder had slowed into the creek below. Curtis cut through a windfall fir with the saw, and rolled the rounds off the edge with the come-along and drove on. He passed the ruins of things as he went, a collapsed water tank, a length of 2-inch steel pipe running along the ditch that had once carried water down off the ridge to somewhere, a sign so rusted it was only a shape. It took him an hour and 40 minutes to go 4.5 miles. Then the trees fell back and he came out on the bald shoulder of Willapa Ridge into a wind that had been waiting for him, and there it was. The tower stood on the highest point of open ground, 41 feet of riveted steel angle iron rising off 4 concrete footings, and on top of it a square glass cab with a hipped roof, a 14-foot square room walled in windows on every side, the kind of lookout the men of the Civilian Conservation Corps had built all over the Coast Range in the middle of the 1930s, and the government had spent the 60 years since taking down one by one. This one they had not taken down. It had simply been left. The way a thing is left when tearing it down costs more than ignoring it. The steel had gone the deep, even brown of long rust, not the loud orange of new rust, but the settled brown of metal that had made its peace with the weather. Some of the cab's windows were gone, and some were only cracked, and 2 on the west side were boarded with plywood that had itself begun to delaminate and curl. A galvanized cable stayed the tower to a deadman anchor on each corner. The stairs went up the inside of the frame in steel switchback flights, and Curtis could see from the ground that the clerk had told the truth about them, that at the 3rd landing the treads had been replaced at some point with wood, and the wood had rotted, and there was a flight and a half near the top that was simply not there anymore, just the steel stringers running up empty into the underside of the cab. He stood in the wind and looked up at it for a long time. It was the loneliest thing he had ever seen, and he had cut line alone at night in country where no one had ever been. A tower is built to be occupied. An empty one has a specific wrongness to it, like a house with the door standing open. He thought about a man living up in that glass box in the weather, 60 miles of ridges and clear cuts, and the gray ocean laid out around him in every direction, and he could not, standing there, imagine why a person would do it, or for how long a person could. The shutter room was at the base, built into the concrete and timber cribbing between the 4 footings, a low room maybe 8 feet by 10 with a single steel door. In a manned lookout, it would have held the window shutters they put up when they closed for the winter, and the tools, and the batteries, and the fuel, and the dry goods. The door was steel plate, and over it, through 2 welded hasps that had not been part of the original building, someone had run a heavy padlock, a brass shackled lock the size of Curtis's fist, and the lock was not rusted, shut the way everything else on the ridge was rusted. It was oiled. Someone had oiled that lock, and not so very long ago. Curtis stood in front of the door and did not immediately cut the lock. It felt, absurdly, like it wasn't his to cut, though the deed in the truck said every rivet of the place was his now. He put his hand flat on the cold steel of the door. Then he went and got the bolt cutters out of the truck, the big 3-foot ones, and set the jaws on the shackle and put his weight into it, and it took both hands and his shoulder and the whole of his good arm, and the shackle gave with a sound like a rifle shot that the wind snatched off the ridge and carried away. The lock fell in the mud. He worked the hasps free and pulled the door, and it dragged on its hinges and stopped half open, and the smell that came out was not the smell of a dead building. It was dry, and it was the smell of paper and old metal, and a chemical sharpness underneath that he knew and could not place, and he stood in the doorway with the gray light behind him and let his eyes adjust, and then he turned on the lantern. The room was full of shelves, and the shelves were full of boxes, and the boxes were labeled. They were military surplus ammunition cans, the steel ones with the folding handles and the rubber gasketed lids, the kind that will hold a seal against water for 50 years, and there were, Curtis would count them later, 311 of them, stacked on shelves of milled cedar that someone had built into that room by hand, floor to ceiling, all 4 walls. Every can had a strip of tape on its end and a year written on the tape in black marker, and the years ran from 1983 to 2023, 41 years. On the shelf nearest the door, the cans were labeled by season and by name as well as year. Spring 1991 floods, North Families 1997, Peterson Reunion 2003, Willapa High graduations 1985 to 1999. Curtis opened the nearest one with his thumb under the latch, and the gasket let go with a small sigh, and inside, packed upright in glassine sleeves with a fat brick of silica gel desiccant wedged at each end, were negatives. Strips and strips of black and white and color negatives, and under them, flat, a stack of contact sheets, and under those, in a paper folder, finished prints. Curtis took out the top print and held it in the lantern light. It was a photograph of the main street of Raymond in the rain, taken from across the road, and the cars in it were from the middle 1980s, and there was a boy in the frame carrying a paper bag out of a market that Curtis realized, after a moment he remembered. A market that had burned in the fire and never reopened. The print was sharp and true and beautifully made, the grays running clean from the black of a wet awning to the white of the sky, and on the back in pencil was written a date and a place and, sometimes, when the person was known, a name. This one said only, Raymond, Heron Street, February 1986. He stood there a long time with the print in his hand. He had come up the ridge expecting an empty box on stilts, a liability the county had handed him to be rid of, 41 feet of scrap steel he might sell by the pound. He had found, instead, a room a man had built by hand and filled, one sealed can at a time, across 41 years, and every can was full of the same thing. It was the valley. It was all of it. It was every year of the place laid down in silver and kept dry in the dark. And the man who had made it was the hermit, whose name no one in Raymond had ever bothered to learn. Curtis did not know the man's name yet either. He learned it from a logbook. On the shelf behind the door, apart from the ammo cans, stood a run of ledgers, tall and thin, the kind with a marbled cover and a red cloth spine, and there were 41 of those too, one for each year. Curtis took down the first, 1983, and opened it on his knee in the lantern light. It was a fire watch log. Every page was a day, and every day had a time down the left margin and a weather reading, and, when there was anything to report, a line in that same small hard hand about what the ridge could see. Smoke, azimuth 214, timber unit 9, small own burn permit, checked out, monitored, out by 1600. Column of smoke northwest over Nizelle called Menlo, was /pile cleared. Lightning night, 7 strikes counted on Long Ridge, watch till dawn, no holdover, and at the top of the first page, where a man writes his name in a book, keep it said, in ink that had gone brown. D. Sundberg, Willapa Ridge Lookout. First day of the season, no relief coming, so I stay. D. The initials on the note in his father's file. The disputing witness who would not give a statement. The man had a name, and the name was Dale Sundberg, and he had signed himself into a book on the first day of a season the county had already stopped paying for, and he had written no relief coming, so I stay, and then he had stayed, it appeared, for 41 years. Curtis carried the 1983 ledger and the print of Heron Street down out of the shutter room, and stood in the wind and called the one person he could think of who might be old enough to remember a lookout named Sundberg. He had met her on his third day back in Raymond, in the little historical society 2 rooms off the library, a woman named Loretta Halverson who had retired from the ranger station and now spent her afternoons cataloging the town's photographs, of which, she had told him then with real sorrow, there were almost none, because everything had burned. He had liked her. She was the first person in Raymond who had said his family's name without changing her face. He drove down and found her at the Historical Society with a cardigan on and a space heater going, and he set the print on the table in front of her, Heron Street, February 1986, and watched her go still. "Where did you get this?" she said. "There's 311 cans of them," Curtis said. "Up in the tower." Loretta Halvorsen was 74 years old, and she had worked the front desk and the radio at the Willapa Ranger Station from 1971 until the station closed in 2004. And she knew, it turned out, exactly who Dale Sundberg was, and had known for 50 years, and had assumed, like everyone, that whatever he had been keeping up there had gone into the ground with him. She had logged his radio calls. Every fire lookout in the district checked into the station by radio twice a day, morning and evening, weather and status, and after the district's other lookouts were closed and torn down one by one through the 1980s, Dale Sundberg's was the only voice still calling in, and Loretta was the one who wrote it down. "They cut him loose in '83, she said. She had her hands flat on the table on either side of the print, not touching it, the way you hold your hands near a thing you are afraid to want. The Forest Service and the county both. Aerial detection was cheaper, they said, and the insurance on a manned tower was more than the tower was worth. They closed the Willapa Ridge Lookout. They took his pay, they offered him a bus ticket to wherever he wanted to go, and he wouldn't go. He told the district ranger he'd keep the watch himself, and the ranger thought he was joking, and he wasn't. He stayed up there another 40 years on nobody's payroll. He had a little pension from somewhere, Army, I think, and he ran the whole thing on it." "Ran what on it?" Curtis said. "The watch," Loretta said. "The radio. He kept a radio working up there when the government wouldn't. He bought his own batteries. When the repeater on Nema went down in '91, and the district wasn't going to fix it because there was no traffic on it anymore, he drove down to Portland and bought the parts. And he and a ham operator from Raymond climbed Nema and fixed it themselves. Because without that repeater, his calls couldn't reach the station, and he was not going to be a lookout who couldn't call in a fire. She stopped. I logged every one of those calls for 20 years, and it never once occurred to me to ask who was paying for the batteries. It was him. It was always him. Curtis thought about the run of thin ledgers on the shelf behind the door, and he understood that he had not read the half of what was in that room. He started bringing cans down to her, 4 or 5 at a time in the bed of the truck. The ones on the shelf nearest the door, the ones labeled by name. He would set them on the long table in the back room of the Historical Society, and they would open them together. And Loretta would put on the cotton gloves she used for the town's few surviving photographs and lift the prints out one at a time, and more often than not, she knew the people in them. That was the thing that took Curtis a while to understand, that these were not scenery. Sundberg had not photographed the valley the way a tourist photographs a place. He had photographed the people in it, year after year the same families aging across the decades, and he had known their names, all of them, though not one of them had known his. There was a can labeled North Fork Weddings, and in it was a wedding in a church that no longer stood. And Loretta touched the bride's face through the glove and said that was Arlene Fate, that she had married a Bjelland out of Menlo, that the church was the one that burned. There was a can that was nothing but the Willapa River, 40 years of it, the same 3 bends photographed in every season and every flood, and reading the dates on the backs you could watch the far bank move as the river ate it. And folded into the ledgers, Curtis found, tucked between the pages the way a man tucks a receipt into a book to keep it, was the record of what all of it had cost. Sundberg had saved everything. There were mail order slips from a film supplier in Seattle, 20 rolls at a time, 4 and 5 times a year, going back to the middle of the 1980s. There were invoices for batteries, deep cycle marine batteries he had hauled up the fire road on his back a few at a time. There was a carbon copy of a money order, dated 1991, made out to an electronics parts house in Portland for $211, and clipped to it a note in the small hard hand that said, "Repeater parts, split with the Ham Club, my half." There was a bank statement, one, that had slipped down into the spine of the 1997 ledger, from a credit union in Raymond, and the balance at the bottom of it was $438, and the deposits down the side were all the same, the third of every month, the exact even number of a small government pension, and the withdrawals were film and batteries and a propane account and almost nothing else. No car payment, no mortgage, no trips. A man had lived on a little under $1,000 a month for 40 years in a glass box and spent a third of it keeping a radio alive that the government had decided the valley did not need. And the valley had never known, and Curtis sat at the long table with that one bank statement in his hand and had to go outside for a while. "He was buying our safety out of pocket," he said to Loretta when he came back in. "The whole time. Nobody asked him to, nobody paid him. He just decided the watch shouldn't stop, and then he paid for it himself until he died." "I know," Loretta said. She had taken the gloves off. "I've been sitting here doing the arithmetic same as you. 20 rolls of film, 5 times a year, 40 years. The batteries, the propane he ran the radio off in winter." She shook her head slowly. "We used to say at the station that the Willapa Ridge lookout was the last one that never missed a check-in. Never once, in all those years, morning or evening, that man was on the radio when he was supposed to be. We thought it was because he had nothing better to do. He had nothing else at all. It was the one thing he had, and he gave it to us, and we called him the Hermit." They worked through the named cans over 10 days, and the more they opened the clearer it got that what was up on that ridge was not a curiosity. It was the town's memory, the actual thing, the only copy, because the fire of 1988 had taken almost everything anyone in Raymond had owned that was made of paper. The photo albums, the wedding pictures, the baby pictures, the school portraits, all of it had gone up with the houses, and for 38 years the town had carried the quiet grief of having no face to put to its own dead. And the whole time, 4.5 miles up a washed-out fire road, in 311 sealed steel cans, a man they had never bothered to name had been keeping every face they had lost, dry and dark, and in order, waiting. He went back up the next day, and the day after that, and every dry day for 2 weeks, and he read the ledgers. He read them in order, and what came up out of them, slowly in that small hard hand, was the shape of a whole life spent watching. Sundberg logged the weather 4 times a day for 41 years. He logged every column of smoke he ever saw and what it turned out to be, and he was almost never wrong. And 3 times in those 41 years he was right about something, the difference of which was the whole valley. In the summer of 1994 he called in a holdover from a lightning strike on Trap Creek, 11 hours before it showed itself, and the district got a crew on it while it was still a quarter acre, and the log said, in the margin, would have run the Trap Creek drainage, 40 homes. They got it at noon. In the dry September of 2015, he had raised the alarm on a spark from a disc brake on a loaded log truck coming down the Fern Hill grade, had watched it start in the ditch and called it before the driver even knew, and a tanker had caught it at the road. 40 homes here, a dozen there. The man in the glass box had been standing team between the valley and the fire for 4 decades, and sending down the answer twice a day, and the valley had called him the hermit and told its children he never came down. The logs stopped in the fall of 2023. The last entries that year were shorter and the hand was shakier, and the final one, dated the 9th of November, said only, "Heart not right, cannot take the stairs but the once a day now, will finish the season." He had not finished the season. Loretta told Curtis that the way the town knew he was gone was that a pilot on the aerial detection contract had radioed in the following spring that the Willapa Ridge cab was dark, and the door was standing open in the weather. And the county had sent a deputy up the fire road who found what there was to find, and had padlocked the shutter room and oiled the lock and gone back down. And that had been the end of it. No service, no notice, nobody to call. Sundberg had been dead nearly 3 years when the county deeded his tower to the one family he had left it for. But the ledger Curtis kept coming back to, the one he read 4 times, was 1988. He did not read it first. He made himself go in order because he was afraid of it, and because some part of him already knew that whatever the disputing witness DS had seen the night his family's life came apart, it was written in that book, and he wanted to earn it. So he read 1983 through 1987 first, the ordinary years, the floods and the graduations and the log truck fires, and he got to know the hand and the man behind it, dry and exact and alone, and Curtis came to think not lonely, or not only lonely, because a man does not keep a thing this well for this long out of loneliness. He keeps it out of love. Sundberg had loved the valley the way Curtis loved a fire, from a distance, professionally, completely, and had asked it for nothing back, and had gotten nothing back, which was, his father had said, this place all over. Then he read 1988. The summer of 1988 had been the driest anyone in the district could remember. The log said so on page after page, the 10-hour fuel moisture dropping through July into single digits, the relative humidity down in the teens by afternoon, a burn ban going county-wide on the 8th of August, no burning, no exceptions, posted at every landing and gate. And on the night of the 19th of August, at 9:40 in the evening, Dale Sundberg had written the entry Curtis had spent his whole life not knowing existed. 2140. Column hot, azimuth 168, Kessner Unit 14, above the North Fork. Not lightning, clear sky all day. This is a slash burn. They have lit a slash pile on a total ban in the worst fuels of my life. Called it in, no answer at station after hours. Called the sheriff dispatch. It is already crowning in the reprod on the north edge of the unit. It is going to run downhill into the North Fork. There are people down there. And then, lower on the page in the same hand but pressed harder into the paper, so hard in places the nib had torn it. 2205. It is running. Sheriff can't raise a district engine in time. Went to the CB and raised the Okerlund place on the North Fork. The only set answering down there. Told them do not go down the county road, the fire is across it. Go up the fire road and over to Nazelle. Man put his family in the truck. I watched their lights go up and over the shoulder at 2230. They are out. 11 houses will not be. This is Kessner's fire and they will hang it on that man because his was the last permit checked out on that road and he is nobody. And they are the county's biggest taxpayer. God forgive me. I have the whole thing on film, and I do not know that it will ever be safe to say so. Curtis read it, and read it again, and then he sat down on the cold cedar floor of the shutter room, with his back against the shelves, and the lantern throwing his shadow up the wall of ammo cans, and for a while he did not do anything at all. His father had not burned down the valley. His father had put his family in a truck because a voice on a radio told him which way to go, and the man behind the voice had watched their taillights go over the ridge and had known, that same night, standing in his glass box in the light of a fire he could not stop, that the county was going to blame the wrong man, and had known who the right one was, and had it on film, and had said nothing to anyone. The disputing witness who would not give a statement for the record, DS. He had disputed it, once quietly, in a note clipped to a claim file, and then he had gone back up the ridge and kept his mouth shut for the rest of his life, and kept the film. Because he was nobody. Because they were the county's biggest taxpayer. Because a hermit's word against a timber company was a thing that would only cost the hermit, and take from the valley the one man still willing to stand its watch, and change nothing. Curtis understood the arithmetic of it. He had spent his life around men who made exactly that kind of arithmetic, the quiet, unbearable kind, and he hated that he understood it, and he could not, sitting on that floor, say for certain that he would have done differently. There was one more thing in the 1988 ledger. Folded into the gutter between the last page of August and the first page of September was a separate sheet, not a log page. A plain piece of paper folded 3 times and sealed along the edge with a strip of tape gone amber and brittle. On the outside, in the small hard hand, it said, "To be opened only by an Okerlund." Curtis's hands were not steady. He had held a line while a fire crowned 100 feet over his head, and his hands had been steady, and they were not steady now. He worked the old tape loose and unfolded the paper. It was dated the 1st of September, 1988, 12 days after the fire, and it said, "If you are reading this, then you are one of the family I sent up the fire road on the night of the 19th of August, or you are their child, or their child's child, and you have found your way up here, which means the county finally gave you the tower, which is the only thing I could think to leave that would put this in your hands and no one else's. I never learned your names that night. There was no time, and afterward there was no way to ask that would not have started the very talk that would have gotten you nothing and gotten me thrown off this ridge. I have watched your family carry the blame for a fire you did not set for as long as I have kept this watch. I could not give it back to you while I was alive without losing the watch, and the watch was the only thing keeping the next fire off the next family. I hope you can understand that a man can owe 2 debts at once and only be able to pay one of them at a time. The proof is not in this room. This room is only the record. The proof is below, where the water used to be. You were a fire family. You will know how to open it. D. Sundberg." Curtis sat with that letter in the lantern light for a long time. The proof is below, where the water used to be. He thought about the collapsed water tank he had passed on the road and the 2-inch steel pipe running down the ditch, and he understood that a lookout on a bald ridge with no spring and no well had to catch its water somewhere, and that somewhere, in a lookout of this age, was a cistern. If you have made it this far into Curtis Okerlund's story, take a second and subscribe. Because everything up to now has been what one man hid to keep a whole valley safe. And what comes next is what happened when someone with money and lawyers found out it wasn't hidden anymore. The cistern was under the shutter room floor. He found it by pulling up the cedar planking in the back corner, where the boards did not quite match the rest, cut newer, fitted by the same hand that had built the shelves. Under them was a concrete slab, and set into the slab was a square steel plate the size of a manhole, and the plate had been mortared down at its edges, and then, over the mortar, bricked. A single course of red brick laid in fresh cement across the whole plate and the slab around it, so that the way down was not a hatch a man could lift but a wall a man would have to break. Sundberg had sealed it himself. He had put the proof below the water line and then bricked the water line shut and left an Okerlund a letter telling him it was there, because a fire family would know how to open a thing that was closed with fire in mind, which is to say with patience and with the right tool and without hurry, in a way that would not damage what was behind it. It took Curtis the better part of a day. He did not have a jackhammer and would not have used one if he had, because a jackhammer down there in the dark, over whatever was under that plate, was exactly the wrong tool. He used a cold chisel and a 4-pound hammer, and he worked the brick out one at a time, breaking the cement bond at the joints the slow way, and then he chipped the mortar out of the seam around the steel plate the same way, kneeling on the cedar with his burned arm going numb the way it did when he worked it too long, taking rests, drinking cold coffee out of a thermos, and the light going gray to grayer in the doorway as the short October day gave out. When the last of the mortar was gone, he got a pry bar under the edge of the plate and leaned on it, and it came up with a grind, and under it was a dark square and a smell of cold stone, and, when he put the lantern down into it, a chamber. The cistern was a concrete box maybe 6 feet on a side and 6 feet deep, dry as a bone, the way a cistern goes dry when the pipe that fed it has been broken for 30 years. It had been dry a long time, long enough that Sundberg had been able to climb down into it and set on the floor, up out of any damp, a single object. It was a footlocker, steel, painted gray. The paint barely faded because it had lived its life in the dark. Curtis lowered himself down into the cistern, and his boots came down on the concrete floor, and he crouched in a space a grown man could not stand up straight in, with the whole tower and 41 years of watching stacked in the dark above his head, and he opened the footlocker. Inside, in the same glassine sleeves, in the same order, sealed against the same silica gel, were the negatives. Not the prints, not the contact sheets, the negatives themselves, the originals, and they were labeled by frame and by minute, and they were dated the 19th of August, 1988, from 2138 to 2251. 71 frames. Curtis held the first strip up to the lantern and read it backward the way you read a negative. The black's white and the white's black, and even reversed he could see it, the shape of it. A column of smoke standing off a clear cut in the last light, and a boundary sign in the foreground of the frame sharp enough to read, and the sign said Kessner Timber Company Unit 14, and behind it and above it the smoke was already leaning north and down, toward the North Fork, toward a single wide with a boy asleep in it. Frame after frame after frame, the fire growing across the top edge of the unit, the light changing. The time written on the sleeve in a hand that had been standing 41 feet up in the dark watching the whole thing happen and photographing it because it was the only thing he could do that the future might someday use. Under the negatives was a 9x12 envelope, and in the envelope was Sundberg's own account, written that same fall, 3 pages, sworn and dated, and, at the bottom, notarized. He had gone down off the ridge exactly once in 41 years, it turned out, in October of 1988, and driven to a notary in Aberdeen, where no one knew him, and sworn out a statement of what he had seen and photographed, and had it stamped and sealed, and then he had come back up the ridge and put it in a steel box in a dry cistern, and bricked it over and never gone down again. He had built the case. He had built the entire case, chain of custody and all. And then he had buried it, where only the family it was meant to clear could ever reach it. And he had waited, dead or alive, for the county to do the one thing that would put the key in an Okerlund's hand. Curtis climbed up out of the cistern, with the footlocker roped to his back, and he stood in the shutter room in the last of the light, and he did the arithmetic one more time, and this time it came out different. The man had saved them and cost them, the same night his father had said. But that was only half of it, the half his father had lived long enough to see. Sundberg had saved them that night, and cost them the years of the blame because he could not both clear them and keep the watch. And then he had spent the rest of his life making sure that when he finally could not keep the watch any longer, the clearing would still be there, waiting, complete, in a box under the water. He had paid the second debt after all. He had just had to be dead to do it. Word that Curtis Okerlund had gone up to the tower and cut the lock got around Raymond the way everything got around Raymond, which was fast and sideways, and within a month, it had reached the one set of ears in the county that had a reason to care. Ridgeline Resource Partners was a limited liability company registered in Delaware, with a mailing address in Vancouver, Washington, and it had spent the previous 2 years quietly buying up Cutover timberland along the Coast Range, including, that summer, 1,100 acres straddling Willapa Ridge that it had bought from the estate that had bought it, from the estate that had, 4 owners back, been Kessner Timber Company. Ridgeline was Kessner's great-grandchild, corporately speaking, the current form of the same money. It had 2 plans for the ridge. It was negotiating a 50-year logging lease on the acreage, and it had an option agreement with a wireless carrier to put a cell tower on the highest ground on the ridge, which happened to be the little under an acre of Government Lot 3, on which there already stood a 41-foot steel tower and 4 good concrete footings and a graded pad, the cheapest cell tower site in the county, if the county would only clear the title, which the county had been about to do. Before it had gone and deeded the whole thing to an Okerlund to settle a 30-year-old claim, nobody upstairs had been watching closely enough to stop. The letter from Ridgeline's lawyers came to the duplex on Doria Street in a thick envelope, and it was long, and its length was the point. It contended, first, that the county had exceeded its authority in deeding Government Lot 3 to Curtis, because the parcel had been encumbered by an access easement running in favor of the surrounding timberland, which was to say in favor of Ridgeline, and that the transfer clouded a title Ridgeline had a prior interest in, and that the deed should be voided and the parcel returned to the county for proper disposition, by which everyone understood them to mean sale to Ridgeline. It contended, second, that Curtis had entered a condemned structure and removed materials from it, and that any materials so removed were of doubtful provenance and doubtful authenticity, and it noted, in a sentence that Curtis read 4 times, that the company had been made aware of the existence of certain photographic materials, purporting to document historical events on lands in which the company held an interest, and that the company reserved all rights with respect to any use of such materials which it had reason to believe may have been fabricated or altered, and would vigorously oppose their introduction in any proceeding. They had not seen the negatives, they could not have. But they knew what 41 years in that tower might contain, because someone at Kessner had known in 1988 what the lookout had seen, had known there was a man on the ridge with a camera and a clear line of sight to Unit 14, and that knowledge had come down through the company the way the land had. And now that an Okerlund was up there cutting locks, the oldest nervousness in the company's file had woken up. Their move was the only move a lawyer had. They could not disprove a photograph they had not seen, so they were going to get ahead of it and call it a fake before it ever reached the light, and take the tower back on a technicality of easement law before Curtis could ever stand up in a room and say what was in the box. The disposition of the deed went to a hearing before the 3 county commissioners, because the settlement had been theirs to approve, and the challenge to it was theirs to hear, on a Thursday morning in the middle of December in the same gray stone courthouse in South Bend, where Curtis had paid his $741 in October. Ridgeline sent 2 lawyers and a title expert, and a man in a good coat who did not speak. Curtis came with Loretta Halvorsen and a cardboard box. He had thought about getting a lawyer. He had the VA and $3,139 and not much else, and a lawyer to fight a Delaware LLC was a thing that ended one way for a man with $3,139. But Loretta had said a thing to him, sitting in the Historical Society with the space heater going, that had decided it. She had said, "You don't need a lawyer to prove when a photograph was taken. You need the film, and you need the log, and you need somebody who wrote the log down. You've got all 3. I am all 3. And so Curtis stood up in the hearing room by himself, a big quiet man with a shine of grafted skin down his right arm, and he did not make a speech, because he was not a man who made speeches, and he laid the case out the way Sundberg had built it, one piece at a time. Ridgeline's lawyer went first and was smooth and brief. The easement was real, the cloud on title was real, the photographs were a distraction, and photographs, he said, especially old ones, especially ones that had sat unexamined in a condemned building for decades in the custody of a single interested party, could be made to say anything a person wanted. Anyone with a scanner and a printer could produce a print and write a date on the back. The commissioners should void the deed on the easement question and not permit the proceeding to be hijacked by unverifiable claims about a fire 38 years gone. Then it was Curtis's turn, and he did not argue about the easement, which surprised them. He said the easement ran with the access road and that he had no objection to it and no wish to close the road, that Ridgeline could use the road to its land exactly as it always had, and that the easement did not require the parcel itself to change hands, and the county's own surveyor, when the chairman asked him, allowed that this was true, that an easement was a right to cross, not a right to own, and that the deed and the easement could coexist. That took the technicality off the table in about 4 minutes, and Curtis watched the good coat at the Ridgeline table lean over and say something low to the lawyer, and he knew he had guessed right about which of their 2 moves they actually cared about. Before he opened the box, he raised one thing that needed no film at all. The fire marshal's 1988 report, he said, blamed the fire on a permitted debris burn on his father's parcel. But the county had posted a total burn ban on the 8th of August that year, no burning, no exceptions, and it was in the county's own records, and a burn ban meant the burn office issued no permits, not to his father and not to anyone. So the report was self-defeating on its face. It could not both be true that his father held a valid burn permit and that no permit could lawfully have been issued for 11 days on either side of the fire. Nobody in 1988, he said, had ever set the marshal's finding next to the burn ban log and asked how a permitted burn had happened during a ban. He had. They did not answer because there was no answer, and he let the silence sit a moment before he went on. Then he opened the box. He did not start with the photographs. He started, because Loretta had told him to, with the thing that could not be faked with a scanner and a printer, which was the film itself. He had the negatives, the actual strips, 71 frames of them in their glassine sleeves, and he passed them to the county surveyor and asked him to hold them to the window. A forged print, Curtis said, is a piece of paper. A negative is the film that was in the camera. And this film, he said, has an edge on it. Along the border of every frame of 35mm film, the manufacturer prints a code, the film stock and its batch, and Kodak's own records tie that code to the years the stock was made and sold. The stock in these frames was made in 1987 and 1988. It was discontinued in 1990. A man forging a fire in a barn in 2026, Curtis said, cannot buy 1988 film, cannot undiscontinue it, cannot print a 1988 edge code onto a negative he shot last week, because the code is exposed into the film at the factory, in the emulsion, not on it. He said this plainly, without heat. The way he would have briefed a crew on the fire behavior for the day, and the room was very quiet. Then he set the negatives down, and he brought out the ledgers, and he brought out Loretta. She was 74 years old, and she had worked the radio at the Willapa Ranger Station for 33 years. And she was sworn, and she told the commissioners what she had logged on the night of the 19th of August, 1988, because she had kept a copy of her own station log when the station closed, a carbon, in a box in her spare room, for no reason she had ever been able to name until now. And her station log and Sundberg's tower log, read side by side, matched to the minute. At 21:40, her log recorded a radio call from Willapa Ridge Lookout, reporting a hot column on Kessner Unit 14, not lightning on a total burn ban. His log recorded the same call at the same minute. At 22:05, her log recorded the lookout advising that the fire was across the county road on the North Fork and that residents should be routed up the fire road to the Nozell cutoff. His log recorded the same. Two documents, she said, written the same night by two different hands 40 miles apart, that no one had altered because no one had ever thought to look at them together, and they told the same story, and the story was that the lookout had watched a slash-burn escape off Kessner Unit 14, and had spent the next hour trying to get engines to it and people out of its way, and had called it, in the moment, in his own log, Kessner's fire. And then Curtis laid down the notarized statement Sundberg had sworn in Aberdeen in October of 1988, 12 days after the fire, dated and stamped and sealed by a notary, whose commission the county clerk was able to confirm had been active in Aberdeen in 1988, and he said, "This is not a story a hermit invented near the end of his life to make trouble for a timber company. This is a case a man built the month it happened, when he had everything to lose by building it, and did it anyway, and then locked away where it could not be touched until it could not be denied. He did not accuse anyone in the room." Ridgeline was not Kessner. The men who lit the pile were dead or old. Curtis said so. He said he was not asking the county to punish anyone. He was asking it to let the record stand, the real one, the one that had been sitting in a dry cistern for 38 years, waiting for someone to be allowed to read it. The Ridgeline lawyer objected to the film, and to the logs, and to the statement, and the objections went nowhere, because there was nothing to object to. He could call the negatives fabricated, but he could not explain the edge code. He could call the tower log self-serving, but he could not explain how it matched, to the minute, a station log kept by a county employee 40 miles away who had no stake in any of it. He could call the notarized statement hearsay, but it was a sworn instrument with an intact chain of custody, and the man in the good coat had stopped taking notes. Somewhere in the second hour the fight went out of them. There was no move left. You cannot argue with the light that fell on the film, and the light that fell on that film had fallen on the 19th of August, 1988, off a column of smoke standing over Kessner Unit 14, and it had been telling the truth in the dark ever since. The commissioners took a recess and came back and did three things. They found that the easement and the deed could coexist, and left the tower with Curtis. They declined to void the transfer, and the chairman, an old man who had grown up in Menlo and remembered the fire, said on the record that the fire marshal's 1988 origin determination was contradicted by contemporaneous evidence that the county had itself flagged as disputed at the time and never reviewed. And he directed the county to forward the entire record, the film and the logs and the sworn statement, to the state fire marshal for a formal amendment of the origin finding. And he said the last part, looking straight at Curtis. He said, "For 38 years this county has had a paper that says your father set that fire. It is going to have a paper that says he did not. I am sorry it took us this long, son. I am sorry it took a dead man to make us look." Ridgeline withdrew its option on the cell tower site within the month. The story of where the site was and what had been found in it was not one the wireless carrier wanted its name near, and there were other ridges. The logging lease went through on the 1,100 acres, because that was legal and the timber was theirs. But they cut it and moved on, and the ridge kept its tower, and the tower kept its shutter room, and the shutter room kept what was in it, which was the reason all of it had happened. Because the photographs were the thing in the end. The fire and the negatives and the clearing of his father's name were the part with the drama in it, the part the county paper would carry. But Curtis knew, standing in the shutter room after it was all over with the December wind, working at the boarded windows overhead, that the fire was one night out of 41 years, and the other 15,000 days were the real legacy, and they were all still there in 311 sealed cans on hand-built cedar shelves. He and Loretta spent the winter bringing it down off the ridge, can by can, and cataloging it in the two back rooms of the Historical Society. And what they found as they went was the town itself, the whole of it, more of it than the town had ever had of its own. Because everything had burned in 1988, Raymond had almost no pictures of its own life before then, and Dale Sundberg, up in his glass box, had been photographing that life the entire time, out of pure love and for no audience at all. And now it came back down the ridge into the hands of the people in it. There was a woman in Raymond who had not owned a single photograph of her mother, who had died young, and Loretta found her mother in a can, labeled North Fork Families 1986, standing in a doorway with a baby on her hip, and that baby was the woman herself, and when Loretta gave her the print, the woman had to sit down. There was a whole can of the Peterson reunions, 40 years of them, and the Petersons had lost everyone who had ever held a camera. There were the graduations, and the floods, the great flood of 1996 with the Willapa up over the highway, and the log booms breaking loose, all of it, kept dry, kept safe, kept in order by a man the town had told its children never came down. The Historical Society opened the Sundberg collection to the public in the spring. Curtis did not want it named after himself, and would not have it named after his father, and so it was named after the man who had made it, and for the first time since 1983, the name Dale Sundberg was said out loud in Raymond, on a placard by the door, and then in the paper, and then by the school children who came through on field trips and looked at the pictures of the town their grandparents had been young in, and asked their teachers who had taken all of them. A man who lived up on the ridge, the teachers said. A man who watched over the valley, and the children, who still had a story about the hermit on Willapa Ridge who never came down, now had a name to hang on it, and a face, from the one photograph of himself Sundberg had ever taken, a mirror shot in the glass of the cab in the winter of 1990. A lean man with a gray watch cap and a camera to his eye, and 40 miles of ridges behind him. Curtis kept the tower. He could not afford to restore it, and did not try to. But he replaced the rotted flights of stairs one landing at a time over that first year. With treated lumber he bought a few boards at a paycheck, and he rehung the boarded windows with glass, and on dry days he climbed up into the cab and sat where Sundberg had sat and looked at the country the man had loved. He put a radio up there. It was not required of him and no one was paying him, and there was aerial detection and satellites now, but he kept a working radio in the cab. And on the worst days of the dry season, when the fuel moisture dropped and the wind came around to the east, Curtis Okerlund climbed his rotten step tower and kept the watch, because he was a fire family, and because somebody in the valley always had, and because he had finally understood the thing his father said and never explained. The man had saved them and cost them the same night, yes, but he had done more than that, over more years than anyone had bothered to count. He had stood between the valley and the thing that could take it, one long watch at a time, on nobody's payroll and for no thanks, and had asked the town for exactly one thing in return, which was that someday, when he could no longer stand the watch himself, someone would climb up and find what he had kept, and know it, and say his name. The town they never bothered to name had been keeping them the whole time. Now they knew his name, and now the watch went on, and the pictures of everyone the valley had lost hung in the light where the living could find them, which was, Curtis thought, the only kind of justice a place like this ever really got, and enough.